everybody back from another delicious lunch. And we are ready to start our last session of this wonderful conference, Gender, Human Diversity, and Rhetorics of Feeling. And our first presenter is Magally Alegre Henderson of the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Peru, who's going to be talking to us about Androginopolis, or the radicalization of the Peruvian strange society. Magally.
Thank you. I want to make sure that the presentation is looking good.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to start thanking all the organization committee and Monica Bolufer for the opportunity to present my work in this conference. Of course, it would be much nicer to have the opportunity to share with all of you in presence, but it has been a wonderful experience to hear your presentations as well and comment on that. Today, what I would like to present is a paper called Androginopolis, or the Racialization of the Peruvian Strange Society. My beloved Leandro wrote in a letter a male foreign visitor to his dear friend who was inquiring about his impressions on the customs of the capital city of Androginopolis. A former resident of the city himself, Leandro must have known very well those same customs that he was inquiring about, as Philalethes recalled in his response to have been taught in those habits by his very same friend Leandro. The letter explained at length the city's most impressive attribute, the profuse array of maricones. In Androginopolis, this particular kind of men, depicted as black and mulattoes, made every possible effort to tailor their male clothes for having an effeminate look by day and use the protection of the night to fully dress in women's clothes, attending private meetings in discreet parts of the city. According to Philalethes, the maricones, whose male dignity seemed to have waited on them, were committed in Androginopolis to imitate women in any way possible. The movement of the body, the grace, the gait, the gestures, even the slightest movement, everything in them exudes an extravagant and ridiculous effeminacy. In describing these men, Philalethes is very precise in marking them as African descendants, slaves, and free mulattoes. For example, one of the ways used to link maricones with a particular racial group is referring to their woolly curly hair, a phenotype characteristic of African ancestry that is presented also as a characteristic of the maricones. Referring to the maricones, the wood instead of hair that nature has conceived them reduced to half its volume in minute braids, is collected in a bow in such a way that on the tips it forms a frizzy tassel. Some little locks artificially disposed hang upon sides of their foreheads without lacking topes and extensions on the temples. The narrative the narrative goes on to describing a birthday party celebrated in honor of a maricon that took place at nighttime when the maricones felt more freedom to fully dress in women's clothing and organize private gatherings to openly socialize with other men. Invited by a friend to the soiree, Philalethes gave himself a large surprise in noticing that, covered on the obscurity of the night, the ones that he thought were embellished black and mulatto female guests were in fact black and mulatto maricones using the nobiliary titles of fine ladies as nicknames for themselves. Attributed to José Mariano de Aguirre y Mayora, the parish priest of Santo Domingo de los Olleros in Huarochirí, in the vicinities of Lima, Philalethes' letter to Leandro is a fictional note entitled Letter about the Maricones, a famous satire published by the Enlightenment newspaper Mercurio Peruano in 1791 that has become an icon on the LGBTQ Peruvian activism. During this presentation, I will argue the letter is key for understanding the representation of late 18th century Lima, the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru, as a city where some men transformed themselves into female-like bodies that appropriated the urban scene, and where male same-sex desire was attributed only to African descendants, either slaves or free blacks. The Mercurio Peruano, where the letter was published, has been regarded as the main Enlightenment newspaper of the Viceroyalty of Peru. Founded by the Sociedad Académica de Amantes del País, the Academic Society of Lovers of the Country, the newspaper circulation went beyond the scientific circles in the Americas and Europe. As Maricel Mendez has highlighted earlier on this conference, Mercurio's readership transcended gender and social boundaries through newspaper lending and oral reading, incorporating women, indigenous, and mixed descent readers into the Enlightenment debates. In that sense, it results relevant to question to what extent the satire developed by the fictional city of Androginopolis responds to the Enlightenment claim for social reform, and at the same time, how they contributed to the fame gained by the Viceroyalty capital as a city full of effeminate characters and its representations in scientific narratives, paintings, and travel accounts. Any doubt about this satire referring to the city of Lima is clear by a second article published in the Mercurio Peruano 3 months later, entitled Letter Addressed to the Society, offering some reflections on the one that is contained in the Mercurio number 94, in which the maricones are portrayed. The author, Friar Thomas de Mendes y la Chica, under the pen name Tacnes, complained about how the acrimonious satire drew on the previous letter would be enough to completely abolish the vice from the city of Lima, if only it wasn't that profoundly rooted among the lowest bred people, against whom the only effective method to eradicate it was the attentive meticulousness of justice in prosecuting the vice. According to the Friar Mendez y la Chica, a monstrous disorder like the one of these maricones was nearly unbelievable, except for the fact that these freaks were at sight almost at every step. After this, the racial reference comes into play, excluding the social problem from the elites and situating it at the interior of the lower classes. The author explicitly points out to Africans as the one that brought the custom to Lima. In Mendes y la Chica's own words, it has been seen arriving at this city of Lima, blacks from the ship educated among the barbarous and fierce customs of Guinea, full of effeminate bad habits, or more properly said, truly maricones. Even more striking is the similarity between the portrayal of a mulatto maricón in the article of Mercurio Peruano by Filaletes and a watercolor by Leon Sangrat, vice-consul of France in Lima between 1834 and 1839 that is shown on the screen. This French traveler led an important contribution portraying popular characters of Liman urban scene, as well as drawings from the most typical constructions of the old colonial architecture. The similarity between the Mercurio's article and Angrand's watercolor give us evidence on how the satire of Lima was not that far from other historical records. The letter about the maricones described the effort made by them for adapting their clothes in order to circulate freely in the urban space during daylight without renouncing to their fashion preferences. This strategy created a specific kind of fashion described as its best by Filaletes in his letter. The low neckline, the shortened sleeves for leaving the whole arm uncovered, the little jacket, the effort to enlarge as much as possible the clothes in the backside. All these and many other trifles help them, as they can totally renounce in public to the virile attire, to modify their clothing in a way that even the less perspicacious seems a man adorned with the clothes of both sexes. In this way, they present themselves in such an extravagant outfit, the hand at the waist wrapped in the cloak with a feminine air. This description, and I am quoting, although coming from a satirical article, seems to describe perfectly the image created by Engrand more than 40 years later. Leon Sangrat represented an effeminate mulatto young man standing in the street between two other men, a layman riding on a mule and a college student. The inscription at the bottom of the watercolor, not included in the photograph unfortunately, reads the following. A street is seen, lay brother from the convent of Recollects begging for alms around the city, mulatto maricon in a grand lounge suit, philosophy student from the San Carlos College or the University of Lima in a grand parade uniform. The name given to the painting, Street Scene, let us wonder how common this scene might have been in the city of Lima. The recurrence of Angrat in portraying typical personage of the urban life at Lima made us think that even though the maricon could seem an anecdotal personage for the painter, was by no means an infrequent one. The action represented in the painting is very subtle. The maricon and the college student are both smoking while the lay brother passes by riding on a mule. Seemingly, the maricon is being addressed by the student and responds to him with a proud and uninterested look. On the other side of the painting, the lay brother looks askance to the interaction between the student and the maricon. Leon Sangrat highlights the African descendant phenotypes of the maricon by contrasting his mulatto skin tone and shoulder-length dark hair with the lay brother's mixed race skin tone and the lighter complexion and blonde hair of the college student. The maricon is wearing a female blouse with ruffles at its sleeves that let expose the arms as women used to wear, and the clothes enlarged under the trousers at the backside. Also, for complementing the outfit and composing a female-like silhouette are the delicate green shoes, silk white socks, a pink cloak worn over the shoulders, and a headpiece made out of flowers and ornamental combs. The hands are disposed, one on a feminine gesture holding a cigarette, the other holding a wide hand fan. The image of the mulatto maricon dressed on both female and male clothing painted by Angrat illustrates perfectly the Mercurio Peruano's letter. The watercolor illustrates in its complexity the racialization that dominated the representation of maricones in the last decades of the 18th century and the first decades of the 19th. Those men that partially adopted female clothing for daylight walks in the city and that at the first opportunity turned to full female attires, those men that prefer feminine gestures and to imitate females in any possible way, those men walking on the streets pursuing the attention of other males, those were called maricones and were more frequently than not represented as coming from an African ancestry. In doing so, Spanish white and Creole men might have argued that it was a problem that corresponded to the others and not to the core of Lima society. An argument that can be easily related to the European tradition of associating sodomy to otherness that exemplified the war against Islam in the 8th century and that was repeated in many contexts as Europe started to explore and conquest the world from the 15th century on. Far from being the only source, Androginopolis satire was part of a public debate that took place in newspapers, pamphlets, travel writing, costumbrista paintings, religious and criminal records, much of which we will not be able to discuss here because of time constraints. The letter about the maricones illustrates how, by the second part of the 18th century, the word maricon has displaced the term sodomite and was repeatedly used to criticize the abundance of men who transformed themselves into female-like bodies, often racialized as African descent, who actively participated in social life, seeking the attention of other men. By racialization, the maricon, I would argue, the Limeño Creole elite expressed the distrust and social fear felt over being outnumbered by the slaves. The fact that African and indigenous descendants vastly outnumber the white population of Lima is key for understanding the racialization of the Maricón. It is not hard to imagine that in a black city, as has been called, like early 19th century Lima, one of the main targets of social fear and racialization were the people of African origin and African ascent. Moreover, the social fear of a slave and Indian rebellion against their white masters became a recurrent concern after 1780, when Tupac Amaru II led the major Indian revolt in an all of colonial times and called for racial unity against the Spanish, including the early promise to grant freedom to all slaves who joined him, as it is clear by the edict shown in the screen. The revolt called for a brotherhood of people with different racial backgrounds and miscegenated offsprings against the colonial power. This is the combination with some attacks against Spanish and Creole properties during the revolt confirmed the fear the elites had of a racial war against the white people. The social anxiety was compounded by the much feared specter of the Haitian Revolution during the same year of publication of the letters in the Mercurio Peruano, in which slave forces were gaining momentum in their claim for emancipation. The news of the slave revolt in Saint Domingue and the fresh memory of racial war during the Tupac Amaru rebellion ensured that the fear of an uprising of slaves and people of African ascent would be ever present in the social narrative of the city until mid-19th century. The exact period when these narratives about the African descent maricones start to disappear. The classic texts of Alberto Flores Galindo, Aristocracia y Plebe, document and gist of the fear and distrust that African slaves stirred among the colonial elite. By the late 18th century, Lima concentrated 74% of all slave population living in the viceroyalty, and which was most concentrated in the two most popular parishes, the Cathedral and San Lázaro. According to an informant of the Regency, most of the slaves came from Africa, Bengal, Angola, and Guinea. In order to justify their subordination to their owners, the slaves were considered objects, working tools devoid of free will, who were endowed with a limited rationality, and who were intellectually inferior to their masters. Rural slaves were mostly tied to sugarcane and vineyard states on the coast, while urban slaves served mainly as domestic servants, but also as artisans and day laborers who offered their workforce in plazas and streets, and who had to pay a daily or weekly amount to their masters. The number of slaves living in Lima in 1791 was almost the same that it had been the previous century. Around 13,000 in 1636, according to Flores Galindo. But in this same period, the castas had grown from 900 to 10,000, thus rebuilding a process of integration of the African into the urban culture. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the overwhelming size of the people of African descent, who outnumber all other groups, gave rise to racial tensions between the popular classes as day laborers, slaves included, that had to go out on the street and compete with laborers from different racial backgrounds for their daily sustenance. There were also the runaway slaves or cimarrones who found shelter in the populous neighborhood of San Lázaro and in marginal settlements outside the cities. Most of the bandit attacks on the highways were attributed to the cimarrones, even though, as Flores Galindo and more recently Jesus Casomalón had shown, these gangs actually had a multi-ethnic composition, except that Indians rarely joined them. In any case, part of the distrust for slaves was due to the attacks of these bandits, which were an endemic problem on all coastal highways in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Another important element was, again, the constant fear of an uprising of slave and Afro-American people. In any case, the distrust and fear that the Black slave population stirred among the elite is likewise evidenced under the guise of sexual representations. Male slaves represented as extremely virile and female slaves depicted as sexually available are discursive tropes that plague colonial literature, not just in the Spanish colonial context, but also in the American colonies. At the same time, slavery reduced male slaves to a dependent condition in regard to other men, so that they were incapable of legally governing themselves, just as it was believed was the case of children and women. This diminished masculinity was not restricted just to Black slaves, but was also applied to mulattoes, as is shown by the report Mariano de la Torre y Vera, the army of the Alto Peru General Vicar, submitted to the Regency. In regard to mulattoes, the offsprings of Spaniards and Blacks, de la Torre Ibera commented that the term was an analogy with the mules, as their crossbreeding made them third species animals. His analogy had at the same time a sexual connotation regarding the mulatto's masculinity, as all male mules are not fertile. A more common reference to a diminished masculinity is the late 18th and early 19th centuries, was depicting all maricones as working in trades socially assigned to women, including also sexual work. For instance, in his Lima por dentro y fuera, Lima Inside and Out, a caustic book of poems satirizing personage and customs of the city, the late 18th century Spanish poet Esteban de Teraya y Landa dedicated a paragraph to the trades practiced by the maricones, calling them the plague of Lima's climate. In this paragraph, maricones are depicted dedicated to occupations like laundering and ironing, and I read. You will see certain maricones, the plague of Lima's climate, with effeminate voices, corsets, and bandanas. You will see them laundering, ironing, starching with great care, and stretching, when they should be the ones stretched. You will see the implacable hate and the utmost abhorrence they have towards women, and these women are loving them. Teraya also noted the alleged hatred maricones felt for women, in reference to the witty commentaries and public dialogues that maricones and tapadas, women in limeño attire, had in the central plaza while disputing the attention of men. While also Teraya suggested a sense of complicity between them both, based on common interest for fashion, love affairs, and gossiping. For example, referring to the imitation maricones made of women through the use of effeminate voices and particular pieces of clothing, corsets, for instance, were concealed under a shirt and helped to shape a curvaceous body. On the other hand, the use of bandanas was perhaps a more subtle way in which to adorn one's head. At least it was somewhat subtler than a corset. In conclusion, during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the city of Lima witnessed an arising of public concerns on the extraordinary visibility that these maricones were able to obtain as inevitable and characteristic personage of the social scenery. This public concern was expressed by religious authorities, journalists, prosecutors, and police officers, as well as foreign travelers. Beyond the term sodomite, which meant the perpetrator of a sinful act, the word maricon was often used to signify a form of dissident masculinity based on belonging to a community linked to a specific male-to-male sexual preference and practice. I propose that these concerns were also part of the social anxiety that generated the vast outnumber of slaves, free blacks, and mixed-race colonial castas in the capital city, and consequently, the fear of social upheaval, slave insurrection, and racial violence that incarnated both the Tupac Amaru Rebellion and the Haitian Revolution. The public concern on the alleged abundance of maricones was unveiled the visibility that those were able to attain in the social landscape of the city. Most importantly, It has documented in this period the existence in Lima of a Maricon subculture and the development of distinctive forms of public behavior, dress codes, meeting places, and social networks. Max Radiguet, a French traveler, even named this subculture the Strange Society of Maricones. Nonetheless, the visibility of this subculture lasted only a few decades, and by the mid-1850s, the Maricon subculture that has characterized the final decades of Spanish colonial power in Lima disappeared from the public eye. But that is another story. Thank you.